I have the pleasure to give the floor to Charles Landry for his vision of the future of Venice.
I admire all of your stamina for still being here, so congratulations, and obviously it's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk a bit about ambition and imagination in thinking through how this could be a catalyst to become a more sustainable city. I was always struck by a phrase by Patrick Geddes, who was both a biologist and an urban planner, who said, "A city is more than a place in space, it is a drama in time." And it feels very much the last days, these discussions have sort of reflected this drama that we're talking about. Now, of course, I'm an outsider looking in, and I know that was the intention here. But as I think we probably both agree, one is a critical friend, with the emphasis on friend rather than critical. Now, it always struck me, and I'm just showing you images that I've taken in Venice over the last couple of years, of the way people have really thought about their future, and this guy is looking at the scene, but I think he's really looking at the future of Venice. But I think we've already said in various ways that it's a bit like 1 minute to midnight, we need to act, and all these sorts of things. And I think another person who I always loved and admired, Peter Hall, he said, "The city is the laboratory to solve the problems of its own creation." And I think that's, again, another useful phrase to just bear in mind, because I am taking the glass half full approach. I made sure I hadn't drunk too much water. Still half full, no worries. But I have been, since I knew I was coming here, I've been asking as many people as possible, what do you think is the future of Venice? And I did it a lot last week in Macau, which is a mad place. We'll come back to that later. And all these people, Macanese, Portuguese, and Chinese, seem to say, it will sink. And I thought, thank you very much. I wanted some help. I wanted some stimulation from you lot to help me get through this. Now, I think Pierre's exposition has made me feel much more positive and much more glass half fullish than I thought before. And so rather than thinking, let us be the last people who walk out of the door with the water and switch the lights off, there's more to be said, and I do think there are positive opportunities. Although I do think we have to look at the sign system of any city, and here I've just seen so many phobias: hydrophobia, xenophobia, Anglophobia. I'm not surprised, a bit of Anglophobia, far too many Brits around. Well, there are 3 of us around here for a start. But anyway, so clearly these things I think are both amusing but serious at the same time. The other point that you just mentioned is, this was an exhibition, a Russian private exhibition 4 years ago, is about obviously the danger of museumization, and you can't even get out of the museum because it has no exit. But the point that really people are making is, where is the life? What is the lifeblood? And you can already feel the argument I will be building up to, which we've already heard a bit later as I move on. So clearly, we don't want to just visit a set of ruins and have that, and that's not a solution. And even if the ruins are beautiful, as this particular German artist showed in the Arsenale last year. But imitation is always an interesting thing. We talked about imitation a minute ago, and I think it's the best form of flattery, because so many people imitate Venice. I mean, this is the real Venice. I stayed in the Messner Hotel. I saw Naomi Campbell. I thought that was all right in its own sort of way. And that's in the real Venice. I know that the real Venice was obviously supported by things like Sisley and all of that. We know that. So that's the real Venice. And this is the copy of Venice, owned by the Sands Corporation in Las Vegas. And because on Monday I came from Macau, there is the copy of Venice, still owned by the Sands Corporation. And we'll come back to the Sands Corporation later. So this Venice is a version, this copy of Venice, which we all know about, which you might say is fake. The Grand Canal is on the 3rd floor. which is slightly different from the real Venice, but nevertheless you can go on a gondola and buy some clothes from H&M and Zara, which is not desperately inspiring, but nevertheless you get the idea that in the copy of Venice, you get a bit of a sense of Venice. And then you come back to the station in Venice and you see the copy of Venice, which is also fine. And then, just to remind you that there are many more Venices, this is the 600 million euro Venice in Dalian, China. And we'll come back to those owners as well later in the presentation. So, of course, this is about identity. And so the question is Venice therefore being drowned and drained of its identity? Or is there something going on in the rest of the world about the resonance of Venice that gives us some potential that we might be able to use this other resonance that is clearly shown in the copies of Venice that are everywhere? And what it's, of course, about, as it says here, Viva Venezia, is about how to bring life into a city. Now, I think it's also quite good to note, and as we've already seen, here's a Latvian exhibition, which was here recently called At the Edge of Chaos, that chaos, of course, sometimes provides opportunities. And what I also thought it does provide is a way of thinking through some of the negatives in positive ways, that there might be other futures from these seemingly negative things. And I also like the exhibition called Jump into the Unknown. And I think a lot of what we were really saying, and I'm particularly interested in the spaghetti of power, and I adored the 9. How many plagues did you have? Only 7? There were 7 is enough. But I adored those plagues, and I thought, well, let's jump into the unknown and try and get over these hurdles of the plagues. But where do you end up in? Do you end up in the infinite nothing? And that is really what the Venetians seem to be scared about. Because the geology of interests that have sedimented itself through time, as always happens in the historic cities, where the weight of history can push you down rather than push you forward, is one of the issues. And I think it is a moment to actually explore that moment of nothingness as if the obstacles didn't really exist anymore. Since we all know what the big questions are, which have already been discussed, you've all said them, I won't repeat them. For me, the question is, how do you deal, and I promise not to use the word fragility to Pasquale, but I have been using it myself, and I've written a bloody book like nearly everyone else called The Fragile City, because you said the mayor didn't want us to use the word fragile. But there are different forms of fragility, even those we didn't mention today, which is in fact the fragility of all of these problems bumping into each other, in a sense, is itself one of the biggest moments of fragility. So let's hope things don't fall apart in a sort of negative way. Get rid of that book, certainly. Anyway, so these moments of transformation, when you look at cities and you speak to people from different age groups, some feel this is really invigorating. All of these uncertainties have potential within them, many people feel. Others feel, of course, it's precisely the opposite. It's threatening, frightening, and so on. And it's precisely these things together that we need to deal with. And the question to me is how we can create, and I feel one of the lovely elements of our combined conversations was this question of the civic. We haven't actually used the word civic, but this notion of the civic responsibility, obligation, toing and froing, being together, and so on. And it's quite interesting, I was involved a couple of weeks ago in Habitat 3 in Quito, and involved in this process called The City We Need, where about 15,000 people around the world in different cities, and not Venice, unfortunately, discussed what is the city we need. And it was business people, trade unionists, activists, citizens, every type of person you can imagine, scientists, saying, what is the city we need? And as you can imagine, they said exactly all the sort of things we're saying. More walkable, a bit dense, a bit compact, quite inclusive, all of these words. And the question always is, which is why I'm so interested in that transformation point, why isn't it happening when we know what we need and there is global agreement on so many things? Now, I do think we need boring art occasionally, but in general, perhaps not. But what we probably do need is to save ourselves from some things that are happening. And clearly, these things that we see all over Venice have been discussed already today and are real problems because, of course, this all costs immense resources that someone else who is out there has not paid for. We know that. We know, too, that there are many Venetians here. They're guest Venetians, I don't know, they're temporary Venetians. And that's why I quite liked the anonymous pavilion for the stateless. But all that's really saying is Venice is incredibly diverse. I mean, we haven't heard the figures about how many Chinese, Bangladeshis are here, but of course we know there are immense numbers of these diversities. So Venice, as everybody seems to be saying, because it's such an emblematic place, people want it, and because it has this resonance, I think out there in the world, people want it to be the solver, the solution bringer for the wicked problems. Wicked problems are those that are so complex that you don't really know the answer, but you have to deal with them. And in a sense, they're often the issues that really matter to the world. And I'm clearly, because I've still got a glass half full, think there are ways forward to think about that. And I think one of the main elements, for example, in this slide, is changing the thinking, which is the third down. Changing thoughts, how one thinks about the problem, about how people who come in, and I think Greg has outlined that enough, so there's nothing more for me to say from what you've already said. Although I do find it depressing, perhaps. I think selfies are all right on the one hand, but if that's the only thing you're doing, that might not be enough. And next, that picture from the 16th of September that you showed too, Greg, reminds us obviously of all of these problems that have already been discussed. But what for me is interesting is how does one deal with these gondolieri? What would they say if some of the dramatic solutions that we're talking about are actually implemented? Would they give way? Are they part of the discussion? Can we involve them in that discussion? Who would lead the discussion to do that? Who would lead the discussion with the souvenir sellers to discuss, perhaps not necessarily to go down every side road that exists? And this brings me to ambition, because I researched 30 cities in something called Cities of Ambition, why some places solved problems better than others, and why those cities thought it's not okay to be okay. And one of the things I think is really important is I think ambition comes much before any of these other words. It's this sort of energy, electricity, will, motivation. And I really resist the word vision. I think it's really ambition is important, and a picture of what could be. But the aim, I think, and perhaps I'm being a bit old-fashioned, is whether there should be and could be a bigger ethical purpose. And so for me, I saw this sign in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and it said, "Be best not in the world, but for the world." So don't be the best tourist destination in the world, but perhaps be the best for the world. And that, for me, is interesting because we know people have discussed the economic turn in history, the cultural turn over the last 30 years, and now I think people are increasingly discussing the social turn, social turn, and how you can bend the market again to bigger picture purposes, which is another way of saying collaborative ways of dealing with public, private, and community. And when we look at the issues, what are these places of ambitions? What are the qualities they have? Well, one of the main things are they're brutally honest about realities. They treat crisis as an opportunity. They're strategically principled, I think, and tactically flexible. You can read the words. They're bold and tenacious. They're willing to be unpopular for the good. And when we think of this consensus point that Eve made earlier, most of that is really not what the 7 plagues are about. But these are precisely, if we're trying to be scientific about it, the qualities of places that do well. and they're bipartisan on big issues, for example, on the central issues. So for me, that was really, if you look at all these cities that have done well, you could mention some. Turin is getting better, Bilbao, all of these places that have done quite well, and so on. So this question of clarity and focus on those things, to be able to tell the truth, is really one of the main issues. And to really, this is red tape, but the scramble of red tape is obviously one of the big issues that all of them sought to simplify. So what they did is they collaborated across boundaries. All of these, for people who work in cities, are points that are so obvious, getting out of the silo mentality, having big ideas but also small ones and orchestrating them, being open and all of that, etc., etc. But most importantly, walking the talk. And even if you only start bloody small, at least walk the talk on something, because walking the talk generates that momentum which often allows you to do the bigger things. And many of the examples you gave, Bonnie, were really starting. They had a problem, but they did start somewhere. And that somewhere helped the something else happen. And a lot of this was about integrated thinking, planning, and acting in one sort of way. So the creativity bit, or the imaginative bit, this first sentence has taken me 30 years to work out, which is that creativity in this, or imagination, is a renewable resource, because we're continually rethinking, reassessing, trying to solve problems. And heritage, although we often reinterpret it, of course we do, is in some sense non-renewable. And of course, all of that sounds so bloody vague. Because a lot of what we need to do, I think, is make these things that we're discussing visible. I mentioned that earlier when I said about communications. Because unless it's visible, we don't know it's happening. If it's only in this library, all of these other people out there, these, quotes, ordinary people or different people, won't know it's happening. And for me, I'm always reminded that today's classic was yesterday's innovation. And one of them I always think about is the Eiffel Tower, because I saw the Eiffel Tower there, and many of the engineering things, you'll tell me if this is correct, we learnt through building the Eiffel Tower. And what I like is there's a hydroponic building, Musée Branly, next to it. And these two forms of innovation I really like. Of course, the Sands Corporation in Macau has built another Paris, but we'll leave that one for the moment. Now, heritage then in that context are fantastic partners. Everywhere you look, you can see it. I mean, this is the outside of the Arsenale. You know that inside some interesting things tend to happen. That bridge, which I don't know, how long did that take? Did you say 10 years to do? Anyway, it took long enough, is in a sense typically Venetian, but it's completely new and not Venetian at the same time. And when you look at places that have transformed, you can see a few simple issues that have emerged. The first thing is, how do you create the mind shift? Then that question of the mind shift needs to be linked to advocacy, and as I said earlier, stats and strategy. So all of your stuff, Charles, we really need some of these bloody stats to help us work this through, because they obviously give confidence. And this question of the shifting priorities and getting beyond that electoral cycle. So these are the things that cities in transformation have done. And they have projects that prefigure the future. And there must be projects here that are strong enough and emblematic enough that can prefigure the futures that we want here. And I believe it requires a bigger alliance of forces, and perhaps a different alliance of the traditional forces. And this shift we're talking about is essentially a cultural shift in the mind, I mean. And the problem about cultural shifts is that's the shift that takes longest, because that's the one that is so embedded in the mind. So, a picture of a future, it needs this compelling story that unleashes this community energy, that triggers this trajectory beyond self-interest. Of course, we're all self-interested. I'm not pretending we're not. But somehow then involves this new form of bureaucracy that may emerge, the creative bureaucracy, and there are many examples of that in other places. And this collective visualization, which is a sort of form of controlled fantasy, can be incredibly powerful. If you think of sport, how do the best sports people really do well? They visualize everything in advance, and they have an image and a picture. What one needs here is an image and a picture which feels compelling to move forward. And it's got to be simple. Now, obviously, we've said all the things, and I'm not going to repeat that, that if people live elsewhere. But I think one point I would make is that Venice perhaps is trapped in a psychological bubble. And because too much history has perhaps entrapped it, I'm not quite sure. And perhaps, therefore, the solutions that are required might need to sound a bit absurd in order to, in fact, simply get attention. So this question of entrapment is something I've felt here, although I also feel quite liberated here at the same time. So these ghettos that we talk about, this is the old ghetto, is often a mental ghetto, as indeed we can create new mental ghettos in new places too. So, Venice themes, I think it's got to be beyond the mental obstacles. I think, again, obviously people have said things already. You talked about incentives and regulations, Eve. There's got to be lots of no, you can't, and lots of yes, you can. And no, you can't, and yes, you can. These are the political choices. What is absolutely clear is the business as usual model and a bit of tinkering will not deal with it. And it involves all the good ideas that all of you have collectively already said, and obviously I don't want to repeat any of those. But I think being quite radical as a new common sense and sounding quite radical actually might be quite liberating for the city. So this being radical and seeing ahead is obviously quite different, not just the business as usual dealing with that. And obviously, as you know, every city around the world is thinking about this. Where am I going? What is my future? How do you get there? And are asking for these moments of reflection. Practically every big city has gone through, or successful city, has gone through that process. And I saw this yesterday in the Biennale or the day before. What is your from and what is your where to? And I think what, and the what has already been said. But when I just say like that, the young, I'm just trying to keep it really simple. Because there's so many things we could say about Venice. But just let's say the young Venice. Just somehow incorporate that whole notion of the young. Of course, you've got a history and a past, but the young in some sort of way. And obviously, when I say young, I mean more than 10, 20, 30, 40. Set a target for the young, perhaps 2,000, I don't know. Anyway, a number that is a critical mass that's big. The digital is obviously, it's again been said, and I've done a book about the digitized city and how that the opportunities for cities might work on that. And I think what strikes me so much, because there's so much collective intelligence in Venice, is the link between art, science, and technology. These cross-fertilizations, but again we have the problem that everything's so siloed, there are baronies and empires, that this cross-collaboration might be difficult because it's one of the plagues you talk about. But that is where the opportunities lie, the economic opportunities, as does then adding value to tradition and production. And I'm also saying in terms of the what, a call to the world. Let's call the world, let's call some of the young from the world to come here. It doesn't need to be in traditional university settings, it can be in all sorts of settings. And I think these combinations create some sort of model of what could be. So that story, I think, needs to generate a different form of crisis. Not the crisis we've talked about, but a crisis of aspiration. Great cities set the target so high that what is existing never reaches it, and they want to reach it. And if one can find a way of telling this story that is a crisis of aspiration rather than a crisis in the classic sense, I mean, I'll give you an example of a city that did that, the green city of Europe, Freiburg, generated a crisis of aspiration about that, that drove the green agenda in a really dramatic way. So that's a phrase I want to capture, or at least I like it. So obviously the big thing there is the world as a smaller place. The young, we've already discussed. What that would be, we'll see. But I think we need to remind ourselves of the dramatic transformation that the digital provides. Obviously, there's monopolization. This happens to be not the Venice Biennale, the Sydney Biennale, but I'm not sure they realized I would use it as a critical comment as they suck everything into them. But when, as you have described so beautifully, the biggest hotel chain in the world that has no hotels is Airbnb, when the biggest taxi company in the world, Uber, owns no taxis, when the biggest retailer in the world, Alibaba in China, has no inventory, and when the biggest media provider in the world, Facebook, produces none of its own media, we know the world has changed dramatically. And that dramatic transformation at the heart of every bit of our economy is unbelievable. And it really means, as we know, we can't hide from big data. We have to work with it, create a human face to it. Obviously, we know the mobile phone is the key thing. But what it also means, we know it allows us to be here, there, anywhere, and enables the new economy versions of what we're talking about to work much more easily. And of course it can reinvent, as many places are doing, democracy. Helsinki's deputy mayor is called the Twitter mayor. He runs his part of the city through Twitter. Just imagine it happening in Venice. So there are many new ways of running democracy and feedback loops that are happening. And what we are is in the midst of redesigning the world and all its systems, legally, morally, culturally, economically as well. And that, I believe, because of the here-there phenomenon, you can be here, there, anywhere, is a major opportunity for Venice. But what it does raise is the trust issues. Because can you just imagine, in Helsinki, with this unbelievable level of trust, we did research around the levels of trust in various cities, and Helsinki comes top. They can do some of this stuff because the trust level is so high. Whereas I'm not sure about Venice, not for me to answer that. The where, so the what, we've said. And I think we're back to the emblematic Arsenale. Of course, the Arsenale, as we know, was the biggest factory in the world at its time, unbelievable. And I think bits of it right at the end there are completely underused. Occasionally there's a bit of this and a bit of that down there. But it's not. It's so often empty and underused. I think the inventory of underused spaces, there are underused spaces here. Obviously, there's lots of Airbnb. There could be new floating structures floating off the edge of bits of the land in some way. There could be unused containers. There are lots of containers floating around. I've seen them all floating around. Turn them into offices, like Container City in London or whatever. There can be places can be bought and sold. We can have, I don't know, also adapted cruise liners. So that area is one area where I think, and you can go through the back into the city, is just one area which is vast, which could be one of these unbelievable incubation centers that's linked also to the startup culture and so on. You could imagine having competitions around innovation products related to whatever sea business or other businesses as well. Floating structures, I mean, the Dutch are brilliant at that, and so on. And here again, this is Amsterdam. These are some people working in a container. It could be in many other places too. So I think it's all possible. I think there's much more places than we think, even where we say everything is so expensive. And this was in the press the other day, Opera Pia Coletti, where I think 70 homes or 71 homes and I don't know, 780 people applied for these homes, but that's a version of social housing. But there are all these other options I've just mentioned. Because as we know, and this is from the current Biennale, that mixed use, mixing, is to some extent the essence of the great city, the humane city. And within all of this, one could think of interesting ways of building these new places too. So the how, this is more or less the final point, the how. Well, obviously capturing the imagination, so that's how you tell that stories with both insiders and outsiders. So the story is so strong that it gets over difference. The tourism income stream has been discussed, so I won't say more. But now I want to come back to these copies of the copies. I believe, I don't know if you know how much Sands spent on reinventing Venice and Paris. Do you know? $3 billion. So if they're spending $3 billion on reinventing Venice and a bit of Paris, surely they can pay you 1% of royalties. Surely. Or at least 10 million or 20 million. It's nothing, it's pocket money. Another one of the casino things had a little legal dispute the other day, because I read about it last week. They spent $300 million. It didn't bloody matter, yeah? So they can afford to fund these housing things, all of this stuff I'm talking about. And that Chinese guy, it's not a guy, it's an entity that spent 600 million euros. It can at least, what about 2% for some sort of interesting project in Venice? Okay, I think the Biennale mechanism, and Michaela and I talked about this last night, is there are some instances and networks and places that work relatively well, you were saying, organizational structures. And perhaps this is one that slightly avoids that mainstream thing. And perhaps whatever we're talking about here could be some form of partnership that has that sort of attitude that some aspects of the Biennale seems to have. But one of the things is really important is how this is communicated. That's why I'm saying it's got to be simple. I think if we add all the problems, say there are all these problems, and then we express it, it's this confusion, which is why I'm only focusing on one or two things, which was that question of the young and speaking, therefore, to the soul of the people. Because when you talk about the young, you can really talk to people who are in decision-making. Do you ever want to see your child again? You can be so emotional about this, and many of the strategies that have worked well have been able to use the emotions in that way to have an impact. Anyway, all of that would add up together in what I'm calling here the strategy of influence. So I think the money is there. I think the money is there. No, it is there. I know it's there. I mean, I know, I saw this sign, grandi opere, grandi mafia. But anyway, that's a different matter. Let's forget that. I don't want to end there. But perhaps one could copy Torino, because I really like the fact that they have a Biennale Democrazia, which is just a rather good idea. So perhaps that should also be inserted as a little virus into Venice too, and it might refresh the gills of the system. So anyway, it's all been said by many in the Biennales, elsewhere in the streets by you. So there's nothing more for me to say than it's not about money. It's about changing the thinking and the mindset. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles Landry. As is the